Welcome to our seventh author this evening in our Writers, Speakers, and Ideas series for the fall semester of 2020. As you all know who've been attending these talks, generally speaking, they take place on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. and each talk or event lasts approximately 1 hour. You can find a list of these events at our website, Writers, Speakers, and Ideas for Lone Star College-Kingwood. My contact information, which I will put in the chat box right now for everyone, is john.m.barr@lonestar.edu. And my name is John Barr, and I'm a history professor at Lone Star College-Kingwood. Our next speaker, which will be the former, tomorrow night actually, one of the 2 weeks we have two speakers in an evening, will be the former president of Lone Star College-Kingwood, our colleague and friend, Dr. Catherine Pearson. Inspired by Richard Powers' book, The Elder Story, Catherine will discuss the value of a single tree, modern landscapes, and the concept of continuous wildlife corridors. In 2 weeks, on November 10th, we have on hand anthropologist Melvin Connor. He's an MD and a PhD from Emory University who answers attacks on religious faith by some well-meaning scientists and philosophers. An Orthodox Jew who has lived his adult life without such faith, Connor explores the psychology, development, brain science, evolution, and even genetics of the varied religious impulses we experience as a species. So those are two great talks. But tonight we have on hand Andrés Reséndez of the University of California, Davis, who will speak about his award-winning book, The Other Slavery, which addresses a system of bondage that targeted Native Americans, a system that was every bit as terrible, degrading, and vast as African slavery. And I have to go off script here for a bit and just say that Andrés was one of our speakers that was supposed to talk on campus last semester, and he's very graciously agreed to do this now. And as we were just chatting a moment ago, we've probably traded 100 emails on this in preparation for this evening, and we're both just so pleased to have him here. So our format for the evening is, after I introduce Andrés, he will talk. You can see his PowerPoint there on the screen from somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes, and then he'll take any and all questions from the audience that you have on this important topic. So, Andrés Reséndez is a professor of history at the University of California, Davis. A native of Mexico City, he studied international relations, briefly went into politics, and served as a consultant for historical soap operas before receiving a PhD in history. He taught at Yale University and the University of Helsinki prior to joining the faculty at the University of California, Davis. His first book, Changing National Identities at the Frontier, in 2005, explored how Spanish speakers, Native Americans, and Anglo-American settlers living in Texas and New Mexico came to think of themselves as members of one national community together in the years leading up to the U.S.-Mexico War. His book, A Land So Strange, in 2007, looks at North America at the dawn of European colonization through the eyes of the last four survivors of a disastrous expedition to Florida in the 1520s. His book, which he'll discuss tonight, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America from 2016, was the winner of the Bancroft Prize, and it considers the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Indians in the Caribbean, Mexico, and the American Southwest between the 16th and 19th centuries. He is currently working on a book about how humans learned to navigate the Pacific Ocean, something he just told me that he calls the Magellan Exchange, rather than what we all learn about in our history books, the Columbian Exchange. So without any further ado, Andrés, welcome to Lone Star College-Kingwood, and the computer is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, John Barr, for extending this invitation and for persevering through those 100 emails. It is a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for joining us for these very active, amazingly active lecture series. It is an honor to join it. So this is a topic that is very common these days. I've been very involved in some of the discussions about racial inequality here. I've been called to talk about the toppling of statues of Columbus. And I will say a few words about Columbus as we go through. But rather than talking episodically, I wanted to give you a broad overview of the subject at hand, which is often very neglected, as John was saying, and that is the system of bondage that targeted Native Americans, and that tends to fall by the wayside because whenever we talk about slavery, people immediately latch on to images such as the ones you have in front of your screens about African slavery. It is an interesting mirror image of African native or Indian slavery. According to my estimates, it may have resulted in anywhere between 2.5 and 5 million Native Americans enslaved from the arrival of Columbus to 1900. And interestingly, in contrast to African slavery, which targeted mostly adult males, the majority of the victims of Indian slavery were women and children. It was a big deal, but somehow we have chosen to forget all about it or really minimize it. So to get a real sense of this, you might try something like this. Get into Amazon, type in African slavery, and you will turn up more than 16,000 books and counting on the subject. If you type in Indian slavery, you will turn up works about enslavement in the Indian Ocean or Southeast Asia, and just maybe a couple of dozen books about Indian slavery in our hemisphere. And many of them are very targeted studies in specific regions or specific aspects of this trade. Okay, so let me start out by emphasizing that Indian slavery was not a European invention. Mayas and Aztecs took captives as sacrificial victims. Iroquois people waged campaigns on neighboring groups called mourning wars to avenge or replace their dead. And in the Pacific Northwest, for example, closer to where I am in California, elite natives finalized marriages by exchanging captives and slaves as sort of dowries to finalize marriages. So really, along with the rest of the planet, Native Americans enslaved one another for millennia before the arrival of Europeans. And we have plenty of evidence for that. I'm just showing you this beautiful Bonampak mural that some of you may have been to with Maya overlords standing over what are clearly Maya slaves. We have anthropologists and archaeologists are beginning to uncover a whole world of captivity prior to contact. So this is another a town in the Yucatan, in what is now the state of Quintana Roo in Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula, where we have clear evidence of captivity in the city of Sibanche. And of course, if you look at early contact documents, this is the Codex Mendoza, that was granted. It was post-contact, but really it referred to events that happened or the way of life that occurred prior to contact. The convention, the pictorial convention for captives, were people held by the hair, as you can see there, and it was common that continued to be used for decades. If you look at if you can read the Spanish gloss there, it says cautivo in both of these cases. Or captives. So really there is no doubt that this went on beyond contact. But with the arrival of Europeans, these pre-existing practices of bondage, originally embedded in specific cultural context, became commercialized, expanded in unexpected ways, and came to resemble the kinds of human trafficking that are familiar to us today. This transformation, of course, began with the earliest European explorers. Columbus, during his second voyage in 1493, sent dozens of Indians from the Caribbean, and accompanying them was a candid letter addressed to the Spanish monarch. I quote one line just to give you a sense. May your highnesses judge whether these Indians ought to be captured, for I believe we could take many of the males every year and an infinite number of women. and made you also believe that one of them could be worth more than 3 black slaves from Guinea in strength and ingenuity, as you will gather from those that I am shipping out now. And it's interesting why Columbus believed that the slaves from the New World would be better than the slaves from Africa, and we can talk about that later on. But thus, Columbus really inaugurated the Middle Passage, complete with the overcrowding and high mortality rates that we commonly associate with African slavery, but which in fact can be traced further back into these other and earlier slavery of Native Americans. Eventually, all European powers became participants in the Indian slave trade, the English, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, but Spain, by virtue of the densely populated colonies that it ruled, became the dominant slaving power. Spain was to Indian slavery what Portugal and later England were to Africans. Bless you. Ironically, Spain began by forbidding the enslavement of Indians, yet this categorical prohibition did not stop generations of very determined Spanish settlers and conquistadors from taking natives truly on a planetary scale, from the tip of South America to Canada, and from the Canary Islands in the Atlantic all the way to the Philippines in the Pacific. And the fact that this other slavery had to be carried out clandestinely made it even more insidious. So this is really a tale of good intentions gone badly astray. So the Caribbean was the laboratory of conquest, and it was also the first and quite likely the worst native slaving ground in the world. At contact, the Caribbean sustained a large indigenous population, but from this high point, a precipitous demographic collapse followed. And by the 1550s, merely 2 generations after contact, the natives, so memorably described by Columbus as, quote, affectionate and without malice, and, quote, having very straight legs and no bellies, had ceased to exist as a people. As any school child knows, smallpox was a major reason for this devastation. But blaming everything on unintended biological consequences is just too easy and not borne out by the sources. If you read the sources, many of them will give you a very different idea of what went on. Take, for example, the island of Hispaniola, which is the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic that I'm showing you here. Italian demographer Massimo Livi Bacci has recently, or a few years ago, made the crucial point that the very first certain documentation of smallpox in Hispaniola appears only in 1518. And yet, even though 26 years passed before this first documented case of smallpox, the native population of the Caribbean found itself already on a clear path toward extinction. Let me just give you a couple of numbers to get this discussion going. At contact, Hispaniola may have had an indigenous population. This island may have had an indigenous population that we can reasonably estimate at around 200,000 or 300,000 inhabitants. So there were no Aztec sites or Inca sites here, but there were many different villages, some of them quite sizable, of 1 or 2 or 3 or 5,000 inhabitants. We know that by 1508, that figure had fallen to 60,000. By 1514, it stood at merely 26,000, according to a fairly comprehensive census and no longer guesswork. And by 1517, the number had plunged again to just 11,000 Native Americans in this entirety of this island. In other words, 1 year before Europeans began reporting smallpox, Hispaniola's Indian population had dwindled to perhaps 5% or less of what it had been at contact. While it is impossible to rule out completely the possibility of unreported epidemics, it is obvious that other factors were at work in the early years. And as it turns out, Europeans found the largest gold deposits on Hispaniola, and they quickly put the local residents to work. So okay, can you see my arrow? Hopefully it's around here where it says Cibao. This is where the gold mines were located on this island.
I'm doing it. I'm circling it too.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So these were the largest gold deposits in the entire Circum-Caribbean region, and Spanish quickly put the local population to work. So let me show you, we know about this very well because we have a beautiful image by chronicler Gonzalo de Oviedo. Who knew a lot about this because he was actually involved in the gold mining business. And so this drawing that he included in his chronicle, these three individuals represent three different groups. A cuadrilla was a group of people put to work. Usually they would establish themselves close to a river or a stream, as you can see there in the picture. And the first group would dig, represented by the figure to the right, would dig superficially for little nuggets of gold. A second group of natives would carry these large pans, wooden pans known as bateas, to the closest river. And the third group of natives, usually women, would get these bateas, submerge them in the river, in the stream, and move them around so that the dirt would wash away and only the small nuggets of gold would remain at the bottom. This doesn't sound too bad until you realize that this unceaseless activity would be carried on for 13, 14, 15 hours a day. And therefore, these native slaves would be unable to do everything else that was needed for surviving, like planting crops, harvesting, and looking after their children. So not surprisingly, the local population on the island fell precipitously in the manner that I just described. And by 1510, the number of Indians on the island had plunged so drastically that the local population was no longer able to provide enough labor for the gold mines, let alone for everything else. And so the solution was to replenish this dwindling workforce by European slavers fanning out to other islands in the neighborhood. And thus the demographic cataclysm that had started out in Hispaniola and Puerto Rico and Jamaica spread to other islands. And this map I constructed on the basis of some of the licenses. These early slaving expeditions required a express permission, a license from the crown. And so we know where they originated and where they went on the basis of these permissions. So that's what you have in front of you. So gold was really the initial impetus for the European-driven slavery in the New World. But really, if we talk about numbers, the big culprit here was silver. So first of all, I want to give you a little bit of the scope of these business. In the United States, at least, when we think of gold, the unavoidable reference, at least out here in the West, is to the California gold rush. And altogether, California produced some 3.7 million kilograms of gold, and in the process attracted some 300,000 people from the rest of the world. So here is, again, let me move my arrows. These are the amounts that I'm talking about in the 1840s and 50s and 60s of amount of kilograms of gold extracted from the California gold rush. The rest is the silver rush that started much earlier. It really started in the 1520s. It really continued on through the 16th century. It kind of plateaued in the 17th century. Oh, where is my arrow? As you can see. And then it took off in the 18th century, reaching the highest levels all the way to the end of the century, into the early 19th century, when at times the silver mines of northern Mexico were producing upwards of half of the entire silver production in the world. So clearly, in terms of duration, there's no contest between the gold rush of California and the earlier silver rush. What you have to imagine is about 13 California gold rushes strung out in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries to get a sense of the scope. of course, in terms of geography, there's again no comparison. You may have seen some of these maps of the silver mines of Mexico that have a few dots in northern Mexico, but really this is a map with the most exhaustive list of silver mines. Some of them were flash in the pans, but really these are all the mines that were developed in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, as you can see there. And it gives you a sense of how the silver rush started in and around Mexico City, and then to the south towards the city of Acapulco. So from Mexico City towards Acapulco, then the prospectors moved along the western the western slopes of Mexico on the Pacific coast, and finally they moved inland to the high plateau in Mexico, where they found some of the largest silver mines, like Zacatecas, etc. So if this fantastic silver boom had occurred in the 19th century, Mexico would have become a worldwide magnet like California. In an era of newspapers, steamboats, and widespread transoceanic travel, there is little doubt that the great Mexican silver mines would have lured immigrants from all quarters of the world. But because this boom predated all of these communications and transportation conveniences and unfolded at a time when the Spanish monarchy prohibited all foreigners from going to the silver districts, Mexico had to make do with its own human resources, especially Native Americans. California attracted 300,000 people from the rest of the world. Yet colonial Mexico had to satisfy a hugely greater labor demand with no access to volunteers from the rest of the world. And so Native Americans who lived around the mines were the first to be pulled into the quote unquote system. Spanish soldiers and volunteers rounded them up and sold them to the miners for anywhere between 30, 50, 100 pesos a piece. And when local Indian communities became depleted, mining entrepreneurs looked farther afield, and eventually they brought natives from a catchment area that eventually extended as far north as California, New Mexico, and Texas. This is just to give you a sense that this is the labor conditions that you can see even at the beginning of the 20th century. This is a silver mine in Guanajuato by an American mining engineer in 1908. And what he is describing here are what are the type of worker in the mines known as tenateros. So these were the guys whose job it was to go down into the mine, put pieces of ore into these fiber sacks that they carried in the back and that they dangled propped up by a strap on their forehead. And the reason they did that is because they needed to have the hands free in order to hold on to ladders and sometimes like notched logs that were used like chicken ladders in order to get out. So again, this is already in the 20th century, so you can only imagine what labor conditions may have been in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. So these mining connections are very central, as I'm trying to make the point. But these connections explain a great deal of the historical experience of what would become the American Southwest. For instance, in the summer of 1680, the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico rose up and launched the most massive rebellion Spaniards experienced in North America since the early days of conquest. Let me show this. The nervous center of this movement was the Pueblo of Taos in what is now northeastern New Mexico, right here above John in my screen. From inside a kiva or underground chamber used for ceremonial occasions, a local shaman named Popeye dispatched runners to more than 70 native communities, some of them as far as the present-day Hopi Reservation in Arizona, some 300 miles away. I mean, look at that. We're all the way out here. Popeye's plan was to get all these indigenous communities to rise up on the same day to overwhelm the much smaller Spanish population living in this region. And to this end, these runners carried an extraordinary device, a cord of yucca fiber containing as many knots as there were days before the insurrection. And so by untying one knot every day, each community would know exactly when to strike. And indeed, the revolt, the Pueblo revolt as it is known, swept through New Mexico on August 10 and 11, 1680, destroying houses, ranches, churches, and really succeeding mightily. Within 2 months, all Spaniards living in New Mexico were either dead or had been driven out of the territory or the kingdom of New Mexico, as it was known at the time. Writers have emphasized the religious aspect of the Pueblo revolt of 1680. They have focused on the charismatic Popeye and his ability to coordinate so many pueblos. And these authors have been rightly impressed by the burning and defacing of churches and the torturing and killing of friars during the uprising. Explaining, of course, the motives of people in remote times from our own is dicey business. But in my book, I try to make the case that while religion was certainly an important factor, the Spanish enslavement of New Mexican Indians played a major role in triggering this massive rebellion. For one thing, rebellion leaders explicitly talked about it. So one of the demands of the rebels was, and I quote, there were only very few instances in which the Pueblo rebels expressed what they wanted. And so one of them said he wanted that, quote, all classes of Indians forcibly held by the Spaniards be given back to the rebels. One of the rebellion leaders also asked, and I quote, that his wife and children be given back up to him, and that likewise all the Apache men and women whom the Spanish had captured in war be turned over to them. The geography of the uprising is just as suggestive about the importance of the slave trade. Although the uprising is popularly known as the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the movement actually encompassed a large swath of territory along the slaving corridor leading from New Mexico to the mining region of Chihuahua, especially this mine called Parral. This is a 17th century mine that there was a very big deal in the region. And if you juxtapose the area of the revolt, you realize that it went well beyond New Mexico, which is around here. It also included people from what is now northern Chihuahua, like Mansos, Apaches, Sumas, Conchos, Tarahumaras, as well as people from the west, all the way to Sinaloa and Sonora, including Pimas. And we can see that these were corridors of enslavement going into the mine, the silver mine of Parral, and the general area of the revolt coincides very well with these slaving corridors, as I call them. So that's one very important point. Advocating for this interpretation. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of the phenomenon of Indian slavery is the involvement of Native Americans themselves. Native Americans participated in the slaving enterprise from the very beginning of European colonization. However, at first, they played secondary role to the Europeans, who after all possessed the most developed warfare technologies, and I'm especially thinking about horses and firearms. Indigenous peoples became local suppliers, junior partners, guides, guardsmen, and intermediaries. But with the passage of time, they came to acquire European weaponry and horses. And as they increased in power, they came to control a larger share of the traffic in fellow Native Americans. By the 18th and 19th centuries, some of these groups had thoroughly transformed themselves and taken control of much of the business. And this happened not only in what is now the American Southwest with groups like Utes and Comanches, as I'm gonna describe in a minute, but it also happened in places like the Caribbean with the Carib Indians, or in southern Chile with various Mapuche groups over there. But in our region, in the region that we are interested in, the Southwest, the dominant slaving power were the Comanche Confederation, which is shown here wedged between Texas and New Mexico. The Comancheria became a major trading center, and as many historians have recently, or a few years ago, have made very clear, I'm thinking about Pekka Hamalainen, of course, and Brian DeLay, and Joaquin Ribaya Martinez, amongst others. To get a sense, let me just give you a brief quote. According to one witness, in 1744, Comanche trading parties traveled, and I quote, more than 1,000 leagues from New Mexico in the course of a year. So that's more than 3,000 miles. Acquiring captives and returning to offer their loot in the trading fairs of New Mexico. One missionary recorded the enthusiasm caused by the arrival of one of these trading embassies, and I quote, here the governor and his lieutenant gathered together as many horses, metal tools, and everything possible as they can for trade and barter with these barbarians in exchange for deer and buffalo hides, and what is saddest, in exchange for Indian slaves, men and women, small and large, a great multitude of people. For Comanches themselves, of course, the Indian slave trade was not just a business, but a way of life. Comanches sold some of their slaves, but they retained also a large proportion of their captives. One witness noted, for example, in the 19th century that, and I quote, nearly every family amongst the Comanches had one or two captives. Many of these captives were incorporated as secondary wives and were put to work immediately. So Comanche men hunted bison. Here you have them with spears, but also with firearms by the 19th century. But once these animals had been killed, the incredible task of processing the dead animals, preparing the meats, and curing the hides fell into women. And for that purpose, successful Comanche men could have 5, 10, or even more wives. And as I said, these female captives were kind of wives to the wives, or auxiliary or helpers to the wife. In addition to women, boys were the other significant contingent of slaves in Comancheria, and their main occupation was tending to the horses and the mules. As Comanche warriors became successful, the currency was to acquire more horses and animals, and that required tending. And boys were deemed ideal for this kind of work, which, as you would imagine, was harsh, especially in the wintertime, requiring a lot of stamina in really difficult conditions. So for Comanches, to give this example, but for many other groups as well, slaves constituted a very versatile commodity that could be used as an exploited underclass, as pawns that could be exchanged for kin members captured by other groups, or simply as the most ubiquitous form of currency in the region. There was no silver in this region, so captives served as coin. Okay, Indian slavery engulfed the entire American continent, but the timing varied depending on the region. By the 19th century, Indian slavery had nearly disappeared in the eastern seaboard. In colonial times, the Carolinas had been a major Indian slaving ground. New Englanders had shipped Indians to the Caribbean. French colonies in eastern Canada had procured thousands of natives from the Great Lakes region, and so forth. However, during the 18th and especially the 19th century, the traffic of natives was largely replaced and overshadowed by African slavery, as you know all too well. Yet, Indian slavery continued in the West, and the best evidence comes from letters and diaries of westbound Americans, which is what I use in my book. In New Mexico, for example, the first Indian agent of the territory, James S. Calhoun, was amazed by the sophistication of the Indian slave market. And I quote just one line: "The value of the captives depends upon X, age, sex, beauty, and usefulness. Good-looking females not having passed the sear and yellow leaf are valued from 50 pesos to 150 each. Males, as they may be useful, one half less, never more." There was always a premium for female over male, as we can surely discuss. Similarly, California may have entered the Union as a quote-unquote free soil state, but American settlers soon discovered that the buying and selling of Indians was a common practice, and as early as 1846, the first American commander of San Francisco acknowledged that, quote, certain persons have been and still are imprisoning and holding to service Indians against their will, and warned the general public that the Indian population must not be regarded in the light of slaves. His pleas went unheeded, however. The first California legislature passed the so-called Indian Act of 1850, which authorized the arrest of quote-unquote vagrants. It allowed for natives to be hired out to the highest bidder. This act also allowed people to go before the justice of the peace to obtain children for indenture. The Indian Act of 1850 may have affected as many as 20,000 California natives from their parents and labors. I want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to skip. We can talk about the Mormons of Utah, but I'm going to just go to the end, so we have at least 20 minutes to chat. And I will say that so persistent and widespread was Indian slavery that ending it proved nearly impossible. The Spanish crown had prohibited bondage under all circumstances as early as 1542, the so-called new laws, yet the traffic continued. To retain mastery over their natives, European owners resorted to a variety of euphemisms and subterfuges, legal subterfuges, that amounted to slavery in all but name. Another attempt occurred during the early 19th century when Mexico became independent, an independent republic, and proscribed all forms of native bondage who had been born within Mexico, yet Indian slavery persisted. And of course, one more opportunity arose immediately after the Civil War here in the United States, when Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which, as you can read right there, prohibited both slavery and involuntary servitude. These broad formulation opened the possibility of liberation for Native Americans held in bondage in the West. However, in various rulings in the 1870s and 1880s, the Supreme Court opted for a rather narrow interpretation of the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment as well, that applied primarily to African Americans and generally excluded Native Americans who, as you probably know, did not become full-fledged American citizens until the 1920s. Today, 45.8 million people in 167 countries live in some form of modern slavery, according to the latest estimates of the Walk Free Foundation, or at least last year's estimates. Slavery is forbidden all over the world, yet not a single region of our globe has been spared from this scourge. Slavery continues to thrive because its beneficiaries resort to debts or prison sentences or some other subterfuge to compel people to work under the threat of violence and offering absurdly or no compensation. And so with this growing awareness about the present day slavery, what lessons can we draw from the 400-year experience of Native Americans with what I call the other slavery? It seems to me that the emphasis on the newness of the contemporary forms of bondage is myopic. Many social scientists, trace the beginnings of the new slavery to World War II or even later. One cannot deny that, liberalization, that the fall of the Soviet Union and other events accelerated and permitted gave the possibility of the new slavery. But as I have tried to show in this brief presentation, the mechanisms of coercion that underpin such practices are much older. Not only by contemplating this longer trajectory can we begin to gain a measure of the breathtaking dynamism and staying power of this other slavery and its related forms of involuntary servitude and the tremendous difficulties of ending it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. We have a lot of questions, so if you're
Great.
ready, we'll just dive
ready.
right in.
Let's do it. We have 20 minutes.
The first one is from Alicia, and she says, my understanding of the repartimiento was that it forbade slavery until a military threat was established. Could you explain a little more precisely how the Spanish moved from exploration and repartimiento to slavery and slave expeditions?
Sure. Well, the reality is that slavery predated all of this. So slavery was the norm before, because even though as early as 1500, so Columbus, arrived in 1492, 8 years later, the Catholic monarchs had already prohibited the enslavement of Indians, except in a few circumstances. And there were a few exceptions. So, for example, if you found Indians who were cannibalistic, this was such a terrible sin that it was possible to enslave them. Or if you found Indians who had already enslaved other Indians, it was possible to, quote unquote, ransom these Indians from the natives and keep these Indians as slaves. The justification being that it was better for these slaves to be under a Christian overlord than under a pagan overlord. Or peoples who resisted colonization and waged offensive war against the Spanish, it was legal to enslave those people. So there were exceptions to the rule, and so there were always slaves. However, in 1542, with the new laws, Indian slavery was abolished completely, no exceptions made. And this was in, of course, in theory, it continued in covered ways. But one of the ways in which the Spanish crown was, or the colonists in the New World were able to survive these categorical ruling, which would have been impossible to abide by because all the businesses in the New World hinged on the exploitation of coerced Indian labor, was by devising a series of subterfuges, and the repartimiento was one of them. So repartimiento is like a corvée labor system in which, it varied from place to place. There were also repartimientos even earlier in the Caribbean, but the ones that I'm thinking about are in Mexico. And they became popular, especially in the aftermath of these categorical prohibition of Indian slavery in 1542. And so the idea was that a certain percentage of each village would be required to go to work in a public works kind of service or in private services. So, for example, miners would determine what their labor need would be. They would address this request to the royal officials. Royal officials would be in charge of going to the villages, and they would, of course, dragoon basically people to go to the mine. So even though they were regulated, for example, they had to be paid. The pay was symbolic rather than, and sometimes done in clothing and not in metallic. The pay was always very below the market wages. And even though there were limits about how long these repartimiento Indians needed to stay in the workplace before they had to return, oftentimes these regulations were violated. So even though in theory repartimiento was it should not have been a form of slavery, in fact, it amounted to slavery, as I try to argue in my book. And we can go, into other encomienda, we could talk about that, and there were other more regional forms that we can talk about. And of course, later on, we have peonage, etc. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Well, just real quickly, and I think I understand what you're saying here, but it seems to me that what you're arguing is that the idea that smallpox is the only reason that the Indian population was decimated is just far too simple an answer. It's much more complex and related to these exploitative labor systems. Is that correct?
Absolutely. This is exactly what I try to argue in the book. There was actually a synergistic relationship between slavery and epidemics, because basically slaving raids spread epidemics and decimated the Indian population. and the deceased Indian workers had to be replenished by launching additional. So there was a vicious circle of epidemics and slavery. You can't separate the two. The two were intimately connected.
Okay, this next question is from Blake. And he says, so I am a student that read your book, A Land So Strange. He asks, how does the book you're discussing today compare to A Land So Strange? And how did you decide to talk about such a wide variety of subjects?
Well, they are actually, thank you for the question, Blake. The two books are very related. In fact, A Land So Strange led me to the other slavery. I mean, A Land So Strange, as John was saying, is about 4 survivors of this Florida expedition who spent 6 years enslaved on the coast of Texas to the Indians. And so in the process of writing that book, I learned a great deal about what it meant to be enslaved by the Indians. And moreover, these 4 survivors, as you will recall, escaped this enslavement by transforming themselves into healers and walking across the continent, where the first people they found were Spanish slavers from central Mexico to the north. And so when I was researching that book, it dawned on me that, okay, so this is really the first business, the frontier business taking place at the cutting edge of the Spanish expansion. And so that's how I came to the idea of writing about Indian slavery in a broader sense. Initially, I wanted to do a book only about the 16th century, but as I kept collecting sources about the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, I realized that a better service that I could provide to my readers and to the profession at large was to provide a very detailed overview of the entire system during 4 centuries.
Okay, here's the next question, and this is from Sarah. We've got quite a few. This is from Sarah. She says, absolutely the best guest speaker I've seen. But her question is, so a compliment for you, well deserved. She says, what degree do you have and where from?
So I got my PhD at the University of Chicago, master's and PhD in history. That was back in the wild 90s. So that's my highest degree. Okay,
the next question is from Dave. And he says there is much about treaty negotiations in our literature between Native Americans and Europeans and so on. Was slavery ever a topic of negotiations or treaties, or to what extent was it a topic of negotiation?
Absolutely. In fact, the whole negotiation, so again, the area that I tend to explore because of the sources are the Spanish presence in Mexico and in the Southwest, and I look at the Spanish sources. And for example, when I look at agreements carried out between the Navajo, for example, and the Spanish colonists of New Mexico, the first thing that the Navajo chief did in order to seal that treaty was to round up a few Mexican captives who had been enslaved by the Navajo and to return them to the New Mexicans. And New Mexicans did the same thing. So really one way to formalize these treaties was by exchanging captives, which already gives you a sense of how common that practice was.
I should say to everyone that's listening in, and we still got a lot, if you've got a follow-up question, go ahead and type it in. I'll get it to him. Okay, this is from Sharna, and the question is, with the natives having been turned into commerce or a commodity, wouldn't we consider the slaves learned new skills in order to be more sought out? I think that's the question.
Well, let me just say that that there were markets is pretty remarkable. As I was saying, it is remarkable to me, for example, that there was a very clear price scale depending on gender and age. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, women were always the most expensive slaves, then followed by girls, followed by boys, and then there was a big drop off to adult males. In many contexts, that happened because many of these Native American slaves were meant for domestic service, and so women and children were thought of as a better fit. Women were less threatening. They also had these additional reproductive and sexual capabilities that men did not have. And children were able to learn languages easier and were even able to identify with their with the captors in the fullness of time. So they had some advantages that the adult males did not have. Did they acquire new skills? Absolutely. And did they become more valuable because of that? Absolutely. We have the sample of a few thousand slaves that were shipped from the Americas to Spain. And there were subsequently trials where they were requesting to be liberated. And so that's how we can actually look into the daily lives of some of these slaves in the context of households in Spain. And we can see that many of them actually became weavers, for example. And by becoming weavers, they were able to carve out a little bit of autonomy in the household. They were able to marry, for example, and they were given a separate room. So yes, they did acquire some new skills, but of course the point is that in spite of the skills that they acquired, nonetheless their degraded condition persisted, and so in spite of all of that, their lives were very uncertain, as they could be rented out to other weavers, et cetera, as I found out. So,
okay, the next question is from Nate. He says, in a word, why is it so hard to recognize and understand the scope of Indian slavery in the Americas?
I think for two main reasons. One is the lack of documentation. Indian slavery, as I said, became illegal very early on by the Spanish crown, and so it went on in hush-hush, behind locked doors and in dark corners, because doing it openly would be a risky proposition given the formal prohibition, even though it went on. So number one. Whereas compare that to African slavery, where we have port records, for example. So these Africans had to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and therefore they were counted along the way. There are bills of sale. There are all kinds of records. So that's much easier to follow than Indian slavery, number one. Number two, as I said, because it was illegal and because owners resorted to a variety of subterfuges, we have had a very hard time recognizing or putting together all of these different kaleidoscopic labor arrangements. And so that's one of the things that I try to do in The Other Slavery, is to say that, well, I can't give you a very specific definition of Indian slavery because of the variability of the labor. But I can tell you that there are very common traits to all of these different labor conditions. So number one, natives were moved from one place to another forcibly. Second of all, once they arrived to the place of work, they were unable to leave. Number three, there was violence, or at least the threat of violence, to make them work. And number four, there was either symbolic or no pay to their work. So these four characteristics made their circumstances slave-like, regardless of what term you used to call that particular labor institution.
Okay, they're still coming in. Lots of questions.
Okay. All right.
I hope I pronounced his name correctly. If I don't, please forgive me. Sarai Israel asks you this. After viewing your presentation and speech, first, I love how throughout your talk you compare Indian and African slavery. Can you say that Indian slavery or African slavery was harsher? Which was worse?
Well, this is a question that I posed myself before I started writing the book, and I very quickly concluded that I don't want to turn it into a race to the bottom. I mean, both populations suffered immeasurably because of their respective forms of slavery. I mean, you could probably compare percentages of decline, but we have relatively few data points to do that. But I don't want to, as I said, I don't want to turn this into a race to the bottom. Okay. So it's, yeah.
Okay. The next question, this is from Sharna, a bit of a follow-up question, but nevertheless, She says, or he says, can we still consider natives liberated, even though the U.S. today is taking away native land?
Well, I mean that's a general. Let me just say more broadly, take a step back and reframe a little bit that question and say that it seems peculiar to me that we are fixated on African slavery, which in some ways was a very atypical form of slavery. So this is the kind of slavery in which all the great powers of the world agreed to make it legal. And that's just not the way in which slavery occurs in much of the history of the world, many of the regions of the world. So I call the other slavery, but in fact, this should be the slavery because this is the most typical, which is slavery is outlawed and forbidden, yet it happens on the ground. And so in that respect, I see the other slavery as an interesting antecedent to the kinds of human trafficking that occurs even today. So this is not a story in which Native Americans were liberated and then that was the end of it and then we moved on, but rather it is an ongoing story that remains until the present and connects to the present forms of human trafficking. Now, in my work, I took the story up until 1900, and so I can tell you in great detail how these forms evolved throughout the 20th century. So with very little connective tissue, I jumped into an epilogue in which I tried to bring the story to the present. But let me tell you that I am very glad that I did, because many of the forms of human trafficking that I became interested as a result of writing this book in contemporary forms resonated very powerful with what I had been reading about for the 19th or the 18th centuries. And so in some ways, I see that as a good way of using history in order to shine a light on conditions that exist until today.
Andres, would you have a recommendation for our students? This is my question, but would you have a recommendation for our students who would like to get involved in terms of the problems of human trafficking and modern day slavery? Any organizations that you would recommend they could get involved with?
Well, let me again take one step back and say that, to my amazement, this is a very local phenomenon. So it manifests itself in different. So, for example, I had no idea prior to writing this book, and when I became interested in modern forms of slavery, that Sacramento, which is just up the road from where I live in the city of Davis, is a hotspot for human trafficking in the United States.
So is Houston.
And so is Houston, maybe, yeah. So I think rather than a nationwide, the best thing is to get to know your community and how it's what's happening, who is doing what, because it is a very dispersed city by city, region by region type of phenomenon.
Okay, next question is from. Thanks for your patience. We still got a lot. They're coming in. The next question is from Sarah. She says, what do you know about the missing Native American women? And I think she may be talking about today, although I'm not sure from the way the question is typed. They are clearly at risk and much more likely to be murdered. I don't know if that's for today or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly who she is referring to.
Sarah, why don't you retype that question and I'll ask it once it gets clarified. The next question is from Cassandra or Cassie, and she asked this question: can you tell us a little bit more about your next project?
Sure. So the next project is totally different. I have to confess to you that after 7 or 8 years of researching and writing this book on Indian slavery, which is a very trying and very disappointing kind of an enterprise, I wanted to something different. So I wanted something inspirational, and so I went to also the Spanish colonial experience, but this time, as they are wrestling with one of the great the greatest exploration challenge in the world, which was to go across the Pacific and return. So I write about the very first expedition that went from the Americas to Asia and back successfully. What's interesting about that is that there's a lot of technology that went into being able to navigate what is far more challenging. I mean, an ocean that is much larger than the Atlantic, that is more difficult for a variety of reasons that we can talk about. And also because quote unquote, Columbus of the Pacific, if we can call it that way, is not a white European, but it is a mulatto man from the southern Portugal, from the Algarve region, which was the preeminent maritime region in the world at the time. So there's an interesting racial dimension to this Colombian moment in the Pacific.
Okay, now I think that this kind of is a follow-up to Sarah's previous question, and Jimmy is asking this as well. So it has been documented that missing Native women placed into the sex trafficking trade and oftentimes harmed remains an ongoing phenomenon. Do you see connections between this problem and your own project in the other slavery?
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, one of the amazing realizations that came with this project is the enormous differential that existed between men and women, and the marked preference of slavers to take women rather than men. So, for example, the price differentials in New Mexico or the Caribbean or Chile, so throughout the entire hemisphere, could be up to 40 and 50%. Women were 40 or 50 or even 60% more expensive than men. And you could argue it's difficult to know exactly why there was this persistent, and this price premium also remained from the 16th through the 19th centuries. So you can interpret this price premium in different ways. You could say that maybe there were fewer women, or women were more difficult to capture. I don't think that is the case. I think it just reflects the overwhelming greater demand that existed for women and for girls and for boys as opposed to adult males. So women were the target, the victims of these slaving raids, and I see that all over. So, for example, the Navajo or the Nez people, they are organized in clans, and so and there are different clans, and there's one called the Mexican clan, which is kind of an interesting. It sort of goes back to this slaving era of the 19th century, when many Navajos became the worst enslaved peoples in the 1860s during the years of the Civil War. There were a few early campaigns in New Mexico, but the rest was the military presence in New Mexico was used to wage war on Navajos. And what we see in the New Mexican baptismal records is an incredible spike of Navajo children and women being baptized in the 1860s, which is clearly related to these ongoing campaigns being waged against Navajos, and many of them targeted women. So that's clearly dovetails with what you are saying about the missing women.
And by the way, I just typed in from my colleague Heather Sure the Twitter handle for working locally against human trafficking here in Houston. It's
great. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Do you have time for two more questions?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. This is from Alicia again. And she says, can you fill us in a little more about slavery amongst the Eastern tribes, meaning the Seneca, the Cherokee, and their differing ideas of slavery regarding chattel slavery versus slavery in which captives join the tribe, that sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I could have written about everything, but I might have the Southwest rather than the East. Feel free to send my email, and I'd be happy to provide. There's a lot of work being done on the Carolinas, on Florida, on the various eastern, on New England. So I'd be happy to provide extensive literature. This is a topic that is exploding, and I would not feel, especially knowledgeable about that, but there is plenty of literature to
What is your email? And I'll type it into the chat right now.
Sure, it's ARESENDEZ at ucdavis.edu.
.edu.
Yes.
There you go, folks. You can send him an email with that question, Alicia, if you want a little bit more information on it. And we have a scholar coming in next semester to talk about the Underground Railroad from Texas into Mexico. So we're very excited about that.
Oh, great.
Alice Baumgartner, I think, is the book. And my colleague, Juan Galvan Rodriguez, got her in. Okay, so this question is from my colleague, Steve, and it's this question about scholars have debated whether the racist attitudes of the English made the enslavement of Africans possible or whether enslavement itself produced the racist attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate that with regards to the natives? Did the racism come first with the natives, or was it the slavery that came first? Do you have a stance on that?
A point of view. That's a very tough question, and a chicken and an egg type of question. What I see is, however, is that racial ideology vis-a-vis Native Americans was in lockstep with the slaving rhetoric and the slaving practice. So, as you may know, early on there was a discussion about whether Native Americans were even human. Let me take one step back. So slavery was a sanctioned institution in Mediterranean Europe. If you were in a city in Spain or in the Italian peninsula in the 1400s or the 1500s, you would see a variety of slaves. And before you could purchase a slave, a couple of requirements had to be met, at least pro forma. One of them was that an official had to interview the slave and had to make sure that the slave was properly procured, that it had not been the product of a slaving raid, but rather a formal war declared by a king. And it had to be established that the slave in question was an enemy of Catholicism or Christianity more broadly, and that these slaves were waging an offensive war against the Christian nations of Europe. So all of these things had to, and that's why even in Europe there were some unease about taking slaves. There were many slaves coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, Circassians, etc., and including Greek Orthodox. There was unease about taking those slaves, A, because they were not pagan or Muslim, and B, because they may have been white or whiter. So race already looms even before the arrival of these individuals into the New World.
Okay.
So the same questions were debated with regards to natives, and it was extraordinarily difficult because Native Americans, A, were not anti-Christians, at least not at the beginning, and B, they were certainly not waging an offensive war against Europe. So the enslavability of the New World population was always a very complicated affair, unlike the Africans, for example. And so, but clearly there's a racial element there that worked in lockstep with the slavery.
Okay, I think this is going to be our very last question, and thank you for going over your time with us. We appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
A wonderful evening. The question is, I have this perception from Heather. I have this perception that one feature of a slave system is the viewing of those being enslaved as quote unquote other. Do you think this is accurate with regards to Native American slavery?
Well, I think it again ties into the whole notion of race and racial difference. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the other, it seems like a very broad category. I can't wrap myself around that. But surely the fact that this was a group. So, for example, if you look at the ways in which some of these peoples were enslaved, Apaches, for example, were enslaved because some authorities in New Mexico, the governor of New Mexico, declared the Apache nation as a whole enemy of Christianity and enemy of our people. And so therefore it was possible to raid Apache villages and take Indians and get certificates, legal certificates to hold these people. So clearly the fact that they were being othered, they were enemies, and they were different from us, was a central part of the whole, at least the legal justification for enslaving these people. So yes.
Well, thank you very much. It has been wonderful. It's been great to finally meet you and have this talk and listen to it this evening. And what a great set of questions from everyone.
Absolutely.
Don't forget that tomorrow evening, everyone, we have Catherine Pearson, our former president at Lone Star College-Kingwood, talking about the value of a single tree and broader issues related to that. That should be a great talk. And this has been a splendid, splendid evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.